The aim of the book is really quite simple. It invites Americans to consider the possibility that we have as a nation fallen prey to a set of attitudes toward war, soldiers, and military institutions that constitute a variant of militarism. The book explains the origins of this new American militarism, new in the sense that these attitudes emerged relatively recently in the decades following Vietnam. And it suggests that this emphasis on force is at odds both with our interests and with our founding traditions. And it offers some ideas for how to restore a sense of balance and realism to U.S. military policy. This is the second time today I gave this talk. I gave it this morning at the Carnegie Council, where the average age was at least 70 and everybody wore a tie. And I noticed that I'm the only person here who wears a tie, and I dare say I'm the oldest person in the room. And then the other thing I was struck by as I was waiting to start, you're all sitting there looking at some kind of an electronic sort of gizmo, and I realized myself, here I am reading, even you were using your smartphone to do the introduction, and here I am reading my text off of paper. And how that just must mark me as such a Neanderthal from a different universe. So bear with me. But let me make a point early on, emphasizing some of the things that my book is not. It's not an expression of anti-Americanism. It's not an attack on soldiers. I hold the American soldier in very high regard. As Will suggested, I was once myself an American soldier. And the book certainly is not a pacifist tract. Humankind, I believe, is condemned to live in a world in which political competition will never end, and in which force will always have a place, whether we like it or not. And indeed, to some degree, our hopes of achieving even a modicum of stability and justice probably will require us to employ force from time to time. But my key point of the book is this, that somewhere right around the end of the Cold War, Americans generally said yes to military power. If you want to pick a very specific moment when this occurred, that moment might be early in 1991, when Operation Desert Storm ended in what appeared at the time to be a historic victory. Right then, in 1991, the skepticism about arms and armies that had informed the American experiment from its founding pretty much vanished. Political leaders, liberals and conservatives alike, became enamored with military might. And American military leaders, who ought to have known better, became complicit in marketing alluring visions of future warfare that had no basis in history and that events soon revealed as fraudulent. The ensuing affair has been a passion pursued in utter disregard of the consequences that have ensued. Few of those wielding authority in Washington or influencing opinion in the mainstream media have critically evaluated the implications of valuing military power for its own sake. Fewer still have considered the possibility that cultivating permanent global military superiority might be at odds both with American principles and with American interests. Now, how does this new American militarism, defined as outsized expectations regarding the efficacy of force, a tendency to see military power as the truest measure of national greatness, and a romanticized view of soldiers, how does this new American militarism manifest itself? Well, it does so, first of all, in the scope, cost, and configuration of America's present-day military establishment. Recall that through the first 2 decades of U.S. history, political leaders in Washington gauged the size and capabilities of America's armed forces according to the security tasks immediately at hand. A grave and proximate threat to the nation's well-being might require a large and powerful military establishment. But in the absence of such a threat, policymakers scaled down that establishment accordingly. with the passing of crisis, in other words, the army raised up for the crisis, immediately went away. This had been the case in 1865. It was the case in 1918. It was the case again in 1945. The general principle was to maintain the minimum force required and no more. Since the end of the Cold War, however, having come to value military power for its own sake, the United States has abandoned this principle and is committed as a matter of policy to maintaining military capabilities far in excess of those of any would-be adversary or even combination of adversaries. This commitment finds both qualitative and quantitative expression, with the U.S. Armed Forces dwarfing those of even America's closest ally. Thus, whereas the United States Navy maintains and operates about a dozen large attack aircraft carriers, the once vaunted Royal Navy has none. Indeed, there is in all the battle fleets of the world no ship even remotely comparable to a Nimitz-class carrier. Today, the United States Marine Corps possesses more attack aircraft than does the entire Royal Air Force. And the United States has two other, even larger air forces, one an integral part of the Navy, and the other officially designated as the United States Air Force. Indeed, in terms of numbers of men and women in uniform, the United States Marine Corps is half again as large as the entire British Army. And the Pentagon has a second, even larger army, actually called the United States Army, which, by the way, operates its own air force of several thousand aircraft. All of these massive and redundant capabilities cost money. Prior to 9/11, American military spending exceeded by a factor of 25 the combined military budgets of the 7 rogue states then comprising the roster of U.S. enemies. Indeed, by some calculations, the United States was then spending more on its armed forces than every other nation in the world combined. This was a circumstance without historical precedent. The effect of 9/11 was to increase Pentagon spending by leaps and bounds. In 2001, the base defense budget totaled $287 billion. The budget request released by the Pentagon last week, styled as an austerity measure, comes in at a tidy $527 billion, not quite double what it was in 2001. And oh, did I not mention that the base budget excludes the cost of actually waging ongoing wars? That was $159 billion last year. And it also excludes veterans' benefits. That was $127 billion last year. Add those to the tab, and annual U.S. military outlays at present reach somewhere around $750 billion. In constant dollars, the Pentagon today spending is considerably higher than it was at any time during the Cold War. That is to say, back when we worried about having to fight the communist hordes. More astonishingly still, after the war in Afghanistan ends, if it ends at the end of 2014, projected Pentagon spending will still remain at levels higher than reached at any time during the Cold War. On a day-to-day basis, what do these forces exist to do? Well, simply put, for the Department of Defense, defense per se figures as little more than an afterthought. The primary mission of America's far-flung military establishment is global power projection, a reality tacitly understood in all quarters of American society. That well over a decade after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States continues to maintain bases and military forces in several dozen countries, by some counts well over 100 countries, rouses minimal controversy, despite the fact that many of these countries are perfectly capable of providing for their own security needs. That even apart from fighting wars and pursuing terrorists, U.S. forces, these days augmented by CIA paramilitaries and profit-minded private security contractors, that U.S. forces are constantly prowling around the globe, training, exercising, planning, posturing, and liquidating whoever the White House decides needs to be liquidated, This elicits no more notice from the average American than the presence of a cop on a city street corner. Even before the Pentagon officially assigned itself the mission of, quote-unquote, shaping the international environment, members of the political elite, and again I would emphasize liberals and conservatives alike, had reached a common understanding that scattering U.S. forces around the globe to restrain, inspire, influence, persuade, or cajole paid dividends. The indisputable fact of global U.S. military preeminence also affects the collective mindset of the officer corps. For the armed services, dominance constitutes a baseline or a point of departure from which to scale the heights of ever greater capabilities. Indeed, the services have come to view outright supremacy as merely adequate, and any hesitation in efforts to increase the margin of supremacy as evidence of falling behind. The new American militarism also manifests itself through an increased propensity to use force, leading in effect to the normalization of war. As a consequence, self-restraint regarding the use of force has all but disappeared, whereas during the entire Cold War era, several decades, large-scale U.S. military actions abroad totaled a scant 6 in number. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, they have become almost annual events. The brief period extending from 1989's Operation Just Cause, that was the overthrow of Panama's Manuel Noriega, from 1989's Operation Just Cause to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, featured 9 major military interventions. And that count of 9 does not include innumerable lesser actions such as Bill Clinton's signature cruise missile attacks against obscure targets in obscure places, the almost daily bombing of Iraq throughout the late 1990s, or the quasi-combat missions that have seen GIs dispatched in recent years to Rwanda, Colombia, East Timor, the Philippines, Pakistan, Libya, and most recently in various countries in sub-Saharan Africa. As crisis has become a seemingly permanent condition, so too did war. The George W. Bush administration tacitly acknowledged as much in describing the global campaign against terror as a conflict likely to last decades and in promulgating a doctrine of preventive war. The Obama administration has abandoned the phrase global war on terrorism, but it has sustained the expectation of open-ended conflict. The Iraq War has ended, the Afghanistan war is winding down, but the pursuit of violent Islamists continues with no end in sight. After the Cold War, policymakers increasingly came to see coercion as a sort of all-purpose tool. Among American war planners, the assumption has now taken root that whenever and wherever U.S. forces next engage in hostilities, it will be the result of the United States consciously choosing to launch a war. I was struck the other day, I think it was either Saturday or Sunday, it was an op-ed published in the New York Times by a historian at the University of Texas by the name of Jeremy Suri, calling for preventive war against North Korea. And I was struck by that because I was puzzled by who it is at the Times op-ed pages is sitting there reviewing manuscripts and saying, yes, indeed, this is what the American people need to hear today. Let's opt for yet another war before the last one has wound down. As President George W. Bush remarked, the big lesson of 9/11 was that, quote, this country must go on the offense and stay on the offense. The American public's ready acceptance of the prospect of war without foreseeable end and of a policy that abandons even the pretense of the United States fighting defensively or viewing war as a last resort shows clearly how far the process of militarization has advanced. Now, reinforcing this heightened predilection for arms was the appearance in the latter part of the 20th century of a new aesthetic of war. This was the third indication of advancing militarism. The old 20th century aesthetic of armed conflict is barbarism, brutality, ugliness, and sheer waste grew out of World War I. It's depicted by writers such as Ernest Hemingway and Robert Graves. World War II, Korea, and Vietnam reaffirmed that aesthetic, in the latter case with films like Apocalypse Now, Platoon, and Full Metal Jacket. The intersection of art and war gave birth to two large truths. The first was that the modern battlefield was a slaughterhouse, and modern war an orgy of destruction that devoured the guilty and the innocent alike. The second truth, stemming from the first, was that military service was an inherently degrading experience, and military institutions, by their very nature, repressive and inhumane. But by the turn of the 21st century, a new image of war had emerged. According to many observers, the era of mass armies and mechanized warfare had ended. A new era of high-tech warfare, waged by highly skilled professionals equipped with smart weapons, as they were called, had supposedly commenced. Describing the result inspired a new lexicon of military terms. War was becoming surgical, frictionless, postmodern, and even abstract or virtual. It was now called coercive diplomacy, the object of the exercise no longer to kill, but to persuade. According to Michael Ignatieff, fighting no longer implied the prospect of dying for some abstract cause, since, quoting Ignatieff now, the very notion of sacrifice in battle has become implausible or ironic. This is what people are writing back in the 1990s. In war as spectacle, force had acquired a symbolic value. The aim was no longer anything so crude as laying waste to the enemy. Merely demonstrating that one possessed the ability to do so was itself expected to suffice. To use force was to strike a posture, to manipulate perceptions, or to send a message. This image of war transformed, derived from, but also seemed to validate, in some senses, I think, what Google exists to do. That is to say, it seemed to validate a technology-hyped mood that prevailed during the last decade of the 20th century and persists into the 21st century. By common consent, the defining characteristic of this new age were speed, control, and choice. Information is empowering the individual. Information reduces the prevalence of chance and surprise and random occurrences. Henceforth, everything relevant could be known, and if known, could be taken into account. The expected result was to lessen, if not eliminate, uncertainty, risk, waste, and error, and to produce quantum improvements in efficiency and effectiveness. The potential for applying information technology to armed conflict, long viewed as an area of human endeavor especially fraught with uncertainty, risk, waste, and error, appeared particularly promising. Given access to sufficient information, man could regain control of war, arresting its former tendency to become total. Henceforth, the theory went, swiftness, stealth, agility, and precision would characterize the operation of major armies. Economy, predictability, and political relevance would constitute the hallmarks of war in the information age. In short, by the dawn of the 21st century, the reigning postulates of technology as panacea had knocked away much of the accumulated blood rust sullying war's reputation. Thus reimagined, armed conflict regained an aesthetic respectability that the literary and artistic interpreters of 20th century military cataclysms were thought to have demolished once and for all. In the right circumstances, for the right cause, it now turned out, war could actually offer an attractive option, cost-effective, humane, even thrilling. This new aesthetic made it as far as Baghdad in the spring of 2003, and that was about it. The war inaugurated with expectations of shock and awe delivering a clean and quick victory turned out to be not all that different from any other war worthy of the name, ugly and dehumanizing. Well, what lessons did Americans take from all that our troops suffered and inflicted on others in Iraq? That war was irredeemably brutal and a risky proposition? Not at all. Instead, we persuaded ourselves that missile-firing drones and skilled commandos could soften the brutality and mitigate the risk. This new aesthetic contributed in turn to an appreciable boost in the status of military institutions and soldiers themselves. This is the fourth manifestation of this new American militarism. Since the end of the Cold War, opinion polls surveying public attitudes towards national institutions have regularly ranked the armed forces first. Americans fearful that the rest of society may be teetering on the brink of moral collapse console themselves with the thought that the armed services remain a repository of traditional values, old-fashioned virtue, and competence. Confidence in the military has found expression in a tendency to elevate the soldier to the status of national icon, the apotheosis of all that is great and good about contemporary America. As a consequence, in public today, homage to those in uniform has become obligatory. The one unforgivable sin in our politics is to be found guilty of failing to support the troops. In the realm of partisan politics, the political right has shown considerable skill in exploiting this dynamic, shamelessly pandering to the military, and to those members of the public laboring under the misconception that the armed services are under siege from a rabidly anti-military left. In fact, the Democrat mainstream has long since purged itself of any dovish inclinations. What's the point of having this superb military that you're always talking about? Madeleine Albright famously demanded of General Colin Powell, if we can't use it. As Albright's question attests, and as Barack Obama's inclination to use force has affirmed, when it comes to advocating the use of force, Democrats can be positively gung-ho. Even among left liberal activists, the reflexive anti-militarism of the 1960s has given way to a more nuanced view. Progressives have come to appreciate the potential for using the armed services to advance their own agenda. Thus, the most persistent calls for U.S. intervention abroad to relieve the plight of the abused and the persecuted, those calls tend to come from the left. Oblivious to the implications of this creeping militarism, Americans have for the most part simply accepted it. Indeed, in unexpected quarters, they have embraced it with an enthusiasm that is nothing short of inexplicable. If only by default, the nation's status as the greatest military power the world has ever seen has come to signify a cosmic verdict of sorts, a compelling affirmation of American exceptionalism. In fact, however, our present-day military ascendancy represents something quite different. For all this, seeing armed force as the preeminent expression of state power and military institutions as the chief repositories of civic virtue, the expectation that revolutionary advances in military technology might offer a tidy solution to complex problems, all of this distorts, if it does not altogether forfeit, important elements of the American birthright. Recall that at the outset, the New World, as it was called back when I was a kid, the New World was intended to be radically and profoundly new. The vision of freedom animating the founders of 17th century Anglo-America and of the 18th century American Republic distinguished their purpose from that of the Old World, which was constantly embroiled in bloody disputes over privilege and power. Princes, armies, and perpetual war defined Europe. The absence of these things was to provide a point of departure for defining America. Determined to preserve their freedom and their experiment in popular self-government, Americans knew instinctively that militarism numbered as perhaps the foremost threat to their prospect of doing so. Military power was poison, one not without occasional utility, but a poison all the same, and never to be regarded otherwise. In our time, oblivious to the potential consequences, we have lost sight of that truth. We have chosen to marry the means of the old world to the ends of the new, relying on force and the threat of force to spread the American way of life, or as my favorite writer Max Boot has put it, quoting, imposing the rule of law, property rights, and other guarantees at gunpoint if need be, end of quote. Thus has the condition that worried the sociologist C. Wright Mills back in the mid-50s come to pass in our day. Whereas in earlier times, Mills wrote, Americans had viewed history as, quote, a peaceful continuum interrupted by war, today planning and preparing and waging war has become, again quoting Mills, the normal state and seemingly permanent condition of the United States. And as Mills observed nearly half a century ago, the only accepted plan for peace is the loaded pistol. And with that, I'll conclude, and I look forward to any comments or questions that you may have. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
I agree with every single thing you just said, but I suspect you may be preaching to the choir. What I'm really curious about is what you encountered in terms of an opposing viewpoint to your book. So I listen to what you say, and I'm like.
I mean, if I were a critic of myself, what would be the criticism I would advance?
No, what have you bumped into in terms of people saying you're wrong? Because I listen to everything you've said, and it's like this makes perfect sense. So, but clearly, not everyone agrees.
I think the people who would disagree would say the following. This is a disguised call for a return to isolationism. This is somebody who believes that the United States can turn its back on the world and still provide for the nation's security and the well-being of the American people. This is somebody who has not learned the self-evident lessons of World War II, that unless the United States plays this, unless it seizes the imperative of exercising global leadership, that the rest of the world goes to hell in a handbasket. I think that will be the response. Now, my interpretation of U.S. history, I think a unsentimental interpretation of U.S. history, and in particular of U.S. foreign policy, would go like this. We've never practiced isolationism. From the founding of the Republic, from the moment that we secured independence from Great Britain, successive generations of American leaders have been engaged in an effort to expand American power and to increase American prosperity. And from the time of achieving independence until roughly around the Vietnam War, that effort achieved monumental success. When I was a kid, back in the 1950s, and I was taught about, let's say, the incorporation of North America into the Republic, everything beyond the initial 13 colonies, 13 states, I was basically taught that that was part of a domestic story. It wasn't part of a domestic story. U.S. foreign policy in the 19th century was substantially about acquiring additional territory, which we did by means fair and foul. We bought it, we took it, we negotiated for it, whatever was necessary. If you look at what occurred between roughly 1800 and 1945, we have a story whereby the United States of America, in this presumably mostly isolationist period of time, emerged as the most powerful and the wealthiest country on the face of the earth, probably the wealthiest country in all of history. A tribute to the success achieved by a policy of expansionism, not of isolationism. If you look at what's occurred since 1945, we have attempted to further expand this American imperium and to continue to enhance the security, well-being, and prosperity of the American people. The difference between the pre-1945 story and the post-1945 story is in the outcomes we have achieved. And in particular, the outcomes that we have achieved in this period of time where I'm arguing that we have fallen victim of militarism. If you look at if you look at the story of U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War, an effort at least to preserve, if not to continue to expand the American imperium, it's a story, it seems to me, in which there is no question that we have expended extraordinary resources. Some people estimate that the Iraq War itself will ultimately cost something like $4 to $6 trillion. We've expended enormous resources. Our soldiers have made very considerable sacrifices. Well, I ask you, is the country becoming more secure? Is the world becoming more stable? Are the American people able to share in ever greater prosperity as a consequence of our military exertions? Seems to me to be patently obvious that the answer is no. So again, I'm setting aside actually moral considerations. The Mexican War was a war of aggression, but that's how we got California. I'm not keen to give California back. So setting aside moral considerations, an expansionist strategy pursued over a period of roughly a century and a half was manifestly successful. Perpetuating that strategy over the past several decades is producing quite different and adverse results. And so we ought to think differently about the way forward. Yes, sir.
Actually, in much of what you said, as he said, it sounds very sensible, but the two questions that I think are really important if you have an answer. First, let me give some background so you know where I'm coming from and ask any questions. I was born in Germany when the family was living in Dusseldorf, a city that my father, while he was in the artillery in World War II, had been largely responsible for destroying, and then as an American diplomat had been assigned the task of rebuilding. And he always said he was just as proud of having rebuilt it as he was of having destroyed it. And for good reason. We later lived in Berlin, in the free part of Berlin, West Berlin. And West Berlin was free only because there were British, American, and French troops sitting there, not necessarily fighting, but willing to fight if the Russians would come through that wall. Later, we moved to Ethiopia. And as the Navy moved out of Cagna, and the Military Assistance Corps came out of the Ogaden and went other places, the Cubans came in. Everybody in the neighborhood in which we lived, with the exception of a few houses, were slaughtered, were killed. At the time, there were those who argued that the American force might have saved hundreds of thousands, not millions. If nothing else, it would have kept the Cubans out of there. So the two questions I would ask you, sort of given that background, are really sort of like, if we accept what you've said, the first question is, so what? And the second one is, what should we be doing instead?
Well, the so what is, again, we could argue about this. The so what is my argument would be that an overemphasis on military power, exaggerated expectations of what military power can achieve, are harming the well-being of our nation. We are spending a lot and getting little. And I would argue that that's been the case since the end of the Cold War. I hope nothing I said in my presentation somehow suggested that I'm sort of opposed to the basic U.S. posture post-1945 vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. I spent 7 years of my life living in Germany and the United States Army. I think that the strategy of containment was basically a sound strategy. That the policy of containing the Soviet Union in the aftermath of World War II was probably a necessary mission. But note that the only people who proposed preventive war against the Soviet Union we would view in retrospect as lunatics. Whereas we now live in a time in which, to my knowledge, I may be wrong here, nobody in the Obama administration has explicitly abrogated the Bush Doctrine. I think that's a big deal, big change. So that'd be point number one, that the unrealistic expectations of what military power can do and the recklessness with which we use it don't serve the nation's interests. Don't serve the interests, I think, of stability more broadly. Now, with regard to the Cuba, I don't know that much about. I know the Cubans were mucking around in Africa for a period of time. I have to say, at the present moment, I'm not particularly concerned about the aspirations of the Cuban regime, which seems to me that the revolution has largely failed and does not represent a threat to anybody, as far as I can tell. There was one other point you wanted me to make, and I can't remember what it was.
What should we do?
Well, yeah,
Well, I think.
But it sounds almost like from what you said, it's really the Bush Doctrine. I mean, like, for instance, let me go back to when I was a kid. When I was a kid in Berlin, they used to tell us that even though we were kids, we were, like, important to the protection of the city, because the problem was that the Americans would never fight over Berlin until the Russians came in and shot us. And as soon as they shot us, okay, that would be the reason to fight, okay? That basically...
That's correct. I mean, to some degree, American families of service members or other Americans serving the government in Germany, Western Germany, not simply West Berlin, were basically hostages.
To be shot, okay?
Well, you're overstating it, but...
It's overstated. But the point was, in those days, the statement was very clear. We will not fight until they shoot at you.
Thank you.
Whereas today, what after the Bush Doctrine, which is something I think is just absolutely bizarre, is we will fight when we're in the mood or when we're afraid that they might shoot you.
Yeah, I think you're making my case here
Okay.
for part of the problem.
Is that the core in that?
Well, I think it's part of it. It's not the whole thing. I mean, what should we do? What's the problem? I think another element of the problem has to do with the creation of the all-volunteer force in the wake of Vietnam, and which had the consequence of, for all practical purposes, abandoning a tradition of the citizen soldier. The most important wars in our history, the most successful wars in our history, were wars fought by citizen soldiers, not professional soldiers. Citizen soldiers preserved the Union. Citizen soldiers constituted the forces that went and fought against Nazi Germany and Japan. Citizen soldiers constituted the war in Korea, which is a war fought pursuant to that strategy of containment vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. After Vietnam, we abandoned that tradition. We embraced the idea of an all-volunteer force. And I think that, to me, it becomes increasingly evident that that produced deeply unfortunate and indeed pernicious consequences. Certainly, we have forces today that are enormously competent, well-disciplined, well-motivated, units that display real cohesion, but they don't win. We didn't win in Iraq. We're not going to win in Afghanistan by any sort of traditional definition of what victory is. But because they exist at such a distance to the rest of American society, because the American people are no longer engaged in, seriously engaged in, no longer have a stake in the well-being of U.S. forces. In essence, the state has exerted control over U.S. forces and I think employs them recklessly and foolishly, and the state gets away with it. So what should be done? We should examine whether there's some possibility of reconstituting the tradition of the citizen soldier in some aspect, where our definition of citizenship in some way entails recognition of an obligation of citizens to contribute to the defense of the country. We can have a debate on how to do that. Does that mean we should draft every 18-year-old male and female in this country? I don't think so, because we don't need a military anywhere near that large. Should we perhaps consider the possibility of a program of national service where every 18-year-old male and female would be expected to contribute some form of service to nation, to community, with some number of them serving in the military? Perhaps we could do that. So I think part of the issue here is to reconstitute a definition of citizenship that entails collective obligation. We used to have that at least in theory. Now we no longer have that even in theory. Is that a fair answer? Yes, ma'am.
How do you think that some new aspects of war, asymmetrical warfare, non-state actors, ideologies' role in conflict now, how do you think that might be affecting our mentality about war? And in some ways, because we're maybe still learning exactly how to fight these conflicts, what constitutes a win in Iraq, what would constitute a win in Afghanistan, because we're not really sure what a win is, that we're just throwing money at the problem, maybe?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, go ahead.
What role do you think how war has changed?
Yeah, that's why I was going to interpret the question, and my answer would be, it really hasn't. That the nature of war is immutable. Where I would argue we went wrong, and I was trying to insert this notion into the talk, is in the wake of the Cold War, in the wake of Operation Desert Storm, at a moment when the country was deeply enamored with the potential of technology. You're all in the technology business, I understand that. That at this particular moment, Americans who were interested in national security, in war, people who are very smart but should have known better, they persuaded themselves that technology had the capability to change fundamentally warfare. And it was that expectation, I think, that helped to lay the foundation for the misguided approach we took to responding to 9/11. It was their expectations, the expectations of people like Donald Rumsfeld, specifically, who thought that invading Iraq would produce a quick, easy, cheap, decisive victory, but instead embedded us in a protracted, ugly, inconclusive war against a nation that, guess what, had no involvement in the 9/11 attacks. So I really don't think that war has changed all that much. I think one of the great mistakes that we made was thinking that technology had changed it or was changing it or could change it. And this is not an argument that says that somehow technology is irrelevant to the conduct of warfare. Given the choice between going to war with a muzzle-loading musket and an M4 assault rifle, I'll take the M4 any day. Just think we need to be very wary of the notion that technology has a transformative impact, because it doesn't. I mean, it's really worth contemplating that our adversaries in Iraq, and to some degree our adversaries in Afghanistan, have absolutely given us fits in employing a weapon that we choose to call the improvised explosive device, the IED, which is basically a crudely constructed, homemade mine that some people have calculated you can make for about the cost of a pizza pie. And yet we have spent billions of dollars trying to figure out how to respond to the threat posed by the IED, and the IED has inflicted unspeakable casualties on our soldiers, despite the fact that they have presumably a great technological advantage. Yes, sir.
So, we are in serious debt, and considering the history of the Roman Empire, the Soviet Union, how does that go unnoticed by the top generals? I cannot imagine how they sit there, look at this, and they think, you know what, this is the right strategy. We do need 12 carriers. We do need stealth bombers. How does that logic work? How do they internalize it?
Well, I mean, you know, how the hell do I know? Seriously, Admiral Mullen, who was the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff once removed, said while he was still on active duty that the greatest threat to U.S. national security was the debt. Said that publicly in a speech. Attracted a certain amount of press attention. And then I think basically let that thought drop. I mean, he didn't come back 2 weeks later and say, and here's what we in the military propose to do about that debt. And my point there would be, I think at least in some quarters in the senior military leadership, there's some awareness that this fiscal overextension is a big deal. And yet, one senses that, and I'm just speculating now, that at the end of the day, bureaucratic interests end up trumping those insights. That the Pentagon itself as a powerful entity within the federal government, the services as subset of the Pentagon, for bureaucratic reasons, they're all committed to the proposition that they want to sustain and, if possible, not only increase the size of the pie, but increase their chunk of the pie. Right now, my old service, the United States Army, I know is, my sense is at least that the Army is deeply concerned that the Obama administration's so-called pivot towards East Asia, whatever that means, probably means that the Air Force and the Navy are going to be in a position to argue for more money than the Army's going to get. Or to put it another way, after Iraq and Afghanistan, if somebody says, please explain to me why the United States Army exists, the Army has a hard time answering the question. So I don't think you can underestimate the importance of bureaucratic politics, would be one of my answers. Yes, sir.
So you mentioned a little bit the idea of bringing back the concept of the citizen soldier and having national service for all, some military, some not military. And I'm a big advocate of that idea. I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you think that could be implemented. And one other question is, you mentioned and provided some stats around how we have a larger and more powerful standing army relative to the threats that we have today than at any time in our history. But when World War II came around and we were on war footing, we were putting out a flying fortress every, I don't know how many minutes from a factory.
Right.
And we could quickly pivot with today's technology and the training that's required today of our soldiers. Do you think that it's feasible to have fewer troops and less machinery and to be able to scale up as needed?
I think that it's a great question. So let's pretend we have a force that is a citizen soldier force in which presumably young people would come on active duty for something like a couple of years, and that's it, right? And then they have to go back, they want to go to school, they want to go on with their career. Can we train somebody to fly an F-35? Train them and then commit them to the force such that given a 2-year period of service, we're kind of getting our money's worth? And the answer is probably no. That there would certainly be certain specialized functions where you would want to recruit long service people. That said, I think service in the infantry, crewing an armored vehicle, being an artilleryman, crewing various specialties in crewing warships, driving trucks, maintenance functions. You probably could train people within a period of 4, 6, 8 months, and therefore still get a certain amount, a pretty substantial amount of sort of benefit after they leave their training and are serving in the field, as it were. So you'd have to discriminate, seems to me, in those things where the citizen soldiers, where the citizen soldier would be a good fit, and other more complex, more specialized functions where you wouldn't. And I think you could figure that out. But your first question was, how would you sell national service? I think it'd be a tough sell. Because you're going to have to be able to persuade the nation's 18-year-olds and the parents of the nation's 18-year-olds to participate in this program, to generate sufficient grassroots political support that the necessary legislation could be passed and implemented. And I wouldn't for a second want to tell you I think that would be easy. I don't think it would be. And the way to get it, I think, would be to identify someone in Washington in a position of significant influence who could champion this kind of a cause. I don't know who that would be. I myself, when Senator Webb was elected to the Senate from Virginia, I kind of fancied for a time that he might be a strong, independent, critical voice who would be able to raise first-order issues about national security policy and perhaps promote a debate. Turned out he didn't do that, and after a single term, he left office. I don't know what he's doing. But we need a champion. And maybe the comparison would be the way Senator Ted Kennedy was the champion for health care reform for decades. Indeed, didn't even live to see the success of his enterprise. But he promoted an idea and stuck with it. And eventually, the idea gelled and gained enough support that became reality. Something of the same would have to occur. And I don't want to minimize the likelihood of that happening. It's probably not very great. Yes, sir.
What are your thoughts on the existence of what's been called a deep state that essentially drives military-industrial complex forward and leads us into these never-ending wars? Something like Operation Gladio, as we saw in Italy and Turkey in the 60s and 70s, where the strategy of tension has transformed into a war of terror. Whether you believe that something like that may be going on.
My view is probably not as dark as I think yours is. But there are structural explanations. I mean, we don't have to go as far as deep state. All we have to do is look at President Eisenhower's farewell address, in which he warned of the dangers of a military-industrial complex. There is a military-industrial complex. There is as I suggested a couple minutes ago, there is a national security apparatus that is large and is powerful and has interests that may not necessarily coincide with the interests of the nation itself. So I think there are structural explanations that need to be taken into account. I don't think that somehow it is that these structures, the national security state, provide an adequate, complete understanding of why we do what we do and why we've come to have the view of military power that we come to have. I think you have to take into account ideology, our self-identity, our sense of the role that we are called upon to play in the world that makes us as citizens susceptible to manipulation by people or institutions that may have an agenda, a self-interested agenda. So I'm not willing simply to blame it all on the military-industrial complex. Blame some of it on them. Yes, sir.
Could you talk some about the tendency? There's been a tendency over the last decade by people whose primary concern is humanitarian to want intervention
Right.
to effectively rescue people.
Right.
We find ourselves taking sides in Somalia.
Right.
Or being told that we should have intervened in Rwanda.
Right.
And it's a disgrace that we didn't.
Right.
You have the Mali situation.
Right.
So do you think that gives any momentum to militarism or?
Yeah, I tried to suggest that in the talk. I think that there are people who style themselves as progressives or left liberals who back in the 1960s would have viewed the military as the opposition, to some degree now view military power as an instrument that they can put, that we, the nation, can put to work, to do good deeds or to rescue the oppressed. There's a considerable debate on right now suggesting that the United States should somehow or other intervene in the Syrian civil war, not necessarily directly by putting U.S. forces on the ground, but by establishing, for example, no-fly zones. That's part of the equation.
So what would be your take on this, that war is so destructive and chaotic that that's not a point?
No, my take would be the following, I think. Let's take the Syria case, right? There is a civil war. The civil war is leading to a very substantial number of Syrian non-combatants fleeing their country. They're going to Turkey, they're going to Jordan, primarily. I think some are going to Iraq even. And so the argument would be, well, how can we stand by and let that happen? And my first question would be, okay, well, let's take the obligation to respond to their plight seriously. Why does it follow that the appropriate way to respond to their plight is to intervene militarily? Let us imagine, I don't know what the numbers are, let us imagine there's 100,000 Syrians living in terrible refugee camps in Turkey. Why don't we bring them to America? Why don't we offer them refuge? That would certainly take them out of harm's way. So I don't know that necessarily the appropriate response to a humanitarian problem is send in U.S. forces. Maybe there are non-military ways to express the plight of the people. I think if we would say no, we need to intervene militarily. We need to involve ourselves militarily in the Syrian civil war. Then I think I would say to the people who propose that, how much are you willing to pay? Because it ain't free. Are you willing to raise your taxes? Are you willing to accept the reduction in the entitlements you get from the government? Are you willing to send your kid down to the local recruiter to go sign up to fight on behalf of the Syrian people? Or to people who propose this, are you simply asking the American military to do something so that you can sleep better at night? And then I would say, and if they said, well, yes, I'm willing to raise my taxes, I'm willing to reduce my Medicare, I'm willing to send my kid to go fight, then I think the other question I'd say to the advocate of humanitarian intervention is, tell me what you think you're going to get done. Let's be realistic about what we can achieve. I dare say it is possible for us to use our forces to put an end to the civil war in Syria. There's no question in my mind that we can overthrow the Assad regime. Well, what are you going to get then? How long are you going to stay? Because there's some considerable likelihood that we won't like what follows the Assad regime any more than we like the Assad regime. And in that sense, what'd you achieve? So truly, it's not that I am hard and fast against using U.S. forces for humanitarian purposes. I just think that when that subject comes up, there are a whole host of questions that ought to be addressed candidly and honestly before we decide that it's time to dispatch the 82nd Airborne to some distant country and involve itself in some complex situation. Yes, ma'am.
I wonder, from the perspective of folks who are still active duty, how they would respond to hearing your comments. And so I have a two-part question. One is, when did you start thinking about these types of issues, and how did you think about them as far back as when you were starting out as an officer? Did people talk about it back then? And how do we have this intelligent, thoughtful discussion about where our country goes from here, which you are leading the charge on, without demotivating, especially our enlisted folks who are coming on board with these high hopes of representing their country on the front lines?
Well, the generation when I was raised as a young soldier, it was made clear to me that soldiers are instruments of the state. Soldiers don't have politics, shouldn't have politics. And again, I was commissioned at a time when the Vietnam War was an ongoing proposition and had deeply divided the country. When many Americans, as a consequence of Vietnam and other things going on in the country, had very strong political opinions on one side or the other. I was educated to understand that that wasn't my business. And I continue to believe that, as difficult as it may be, that that's the proper position for a soldier to take. That the principle of civilian control means that people up top, civilians, the civilian leaders that citizens elect, they're the ones who have to deal with these very difficult policy issues. The obligation of a soldier is to simply implement those decisions once they are made. If a soldier cannot in good conscience do that, then the soldier's in the wrong line of work. You know, for example, at BU we got, there aren't too many universities that have Army ROTC, Navy ROTC, and Air Force ROTC. We got all three services, and I get a considerable number of ROTC cadets in my courses, and I think about the difficulty that they have, because in their ROTC training, they're basically being told that they are instruments of the state, and that their job is to implement orders, not question orders. On the other hand, they come into my classroom, and I don't view them as ROTC cadets. I view them as young Boston University undergraduates, people who are becoming mature adults and citizens, and I want them to be able to think critically. And I sort of recognize I might be kind of putting them in a tough spot. On the one hand, they're being told that their job is to follow orders. On the other hand, I'm telling them that their job is to think. So I think it's a problematic thing. Well, I'll just leave it at that. You know, but it's funny when you say, what do they think? I have been struck and indeed, frankly, heartened by the number of emails, mostly, that I'm getting from serving military people, usually young officers, people I've never met, who tell me that they read some things that I write and that it helps them think about their profession, think about the role that the United States plays, think about the wars in which they themselves have participated. Now, it's a self-selected group. And there's probably a much larger number of people who think I'm a jerk. And fortunately, not too many of them send me emails. But I find it heartening that at least there's some audience in the active duty community that seems to be somewhat interested. Yes, sir.
So I commend you for your views and the way you look at the problem, but having read Lawrence Lessig's book on the influence of money in Washington and the effects that it has on society in general, isn't the problem that you described actually easier to solve, not by, I don't know, doing general draft or something, but really to solving the issue of how money influences the decisions that are done in Washington?
I agree with the notion that money plays a big role. We alluded a little while ago to the military-industrial complex, and many of you know that I think Eisenhower considered actually referring in his speech to the military-industrial congressional complex, because the money lubricates politics. But I'll be darned if I can tell you how to fix that. I mean, how do we get money out of, or not, you're not going to get it out, but how do we reduce the significance of money in politics? I mean, that's way beyond my brief, and I'd love to see somebody come up with an idea about how to do it, but boy, I don't know. How would you do it?
Well, Lawrence Lessig.
I haven't read that book, by the way.
Yeah, it's Republic Lost, I believe, is the title of the book. He has some practical advice on how to move there. So.
I'll look at it. Yes, sir.
You preempted a lot of the questions I was going to ask about all-volunteer military force. sure I'm not the only one that holds this view, but it certainly seemed like in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, that the game was a little bit gimmed in the sense that the press didn't fulfill its sort of role as being objective about what the merits were. And I'm wondering in the current debate about situations that are in front of us now, like for example Iran, whether you think that there's been any improvement at all, that whether the debate now and what's said in the press and the questions that are being asked are better or more penetrating or lead to a more open debate than what happened.
Yeah, not particularly. I mean, I share your view of sort of the overall tone of reporting in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, and from my perspective, part of the problem was that the mainstream media had fallen prey to this false notion of what war had become. They bought into the shock and awe notion. I do think that the reporting during, we're talking about Iraq here, the reporting during parts of the insurgency was much better. It was more balanced, more critical, appropriately so. But to tell you the truth, I think that the press then fell for the whole Petraeus surge, counterinsurgency, turned the war around, greatest general since Patton, argument in ways that, in a sense, replicated their failure in the first stages. That now coin, as they called it, became the new American way of war. So, at best, I think the reporting has been mixed, and it's not clear to me that they learned a lot.
Got room for one more talk.
Well, you've been raising your hand, so why don't you do the last question?
My question would be, what do you think about Bill Lynn's hypothesis that what we really need to worry about is order? And if we're not careful, we make the world a lot worse place rather than a lot better place by throwing around power, because we can create more terrorists than we can possibly kill.
I think he's right. I mean, again, I think that's self-evident. I mean, Justinia's going to get tired of hearing me say this because I said it in the breakfast talk. If I were telling a story of U.S. military history over the past 30 or so years now, I would begin it with the promulgation of the Carter Doctrine in January of 1980. That was when President Carter said, Persian Gulf is a vital national security interest of the United States. We'll use all means necessary to include military force to prevent bad guys from taking it over. And I think what Carter inadvertently did was to set in motion a project that has grown in scope and in many respects has grown in intensity over time, in which U.S. policymakers have acted on the presumption that the application of American hard power to that region of the world is going to bring stability. Now, when Carter was talking, he was talking about a rather specific Persian Gulf. I think that over the course of 30 years, the implementation has been over what we now call the Greater Middle East. That if we simply try hard enough, we're going to be able to stabilize that region, and the benefits will be great. Well, if you step back at 2013, and I'll look at all the things that we've done since 1980 from a military perspective in the Greater Middle East, ask yourself if that region of the world is becoming more stable. And the answer is no, it's not. It's becoming less stable. Now, I'm not sure that it's become less stable because of the way we have used our forces, although that's possible. Could be it's become less stable for reasons that basically we have no control over. But regardless, simply trying harder, simply trying to devise new ways of using American hard power, that's what Obama's been doing with these drone strikes. I see no indication that trying harder is going to give us a different result. And that therefore, it's time to ask some very difficult, uncomfortable questions about U.S. policy in the region. And that's a debate that I think few people in Washington are willing to undertake. And it's a debate that people who favor this emphasis on military power are absolutely opposed to. Hey, this has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate you turning out and listening to us.